Oh, I dropped my orange, guys. 1 second. Okay. So, what a sunny topic to end our Unit 7 and start my spring break on, such as genocide. All right, let us get into this topic. So, here's our summary and our chapter. Cool. Next one. Yeah, see, it's only like, what, 64 terms this time? That's not that bad at all. All right. So, this chapter is really scattered, and I understand why AP has trouble with this topic because, just so many people die in the 20th century. So they first want to talk about like the World War I, and then they kind of move to World War II, and then we're going to get into some specific genocides. Okay, so in World War I, we already know that it was a violent thing, and that the kind of violence that happened killed millions of people. Okay, so combatants were heavily victimized as a consequence of the fighting. Like, so many millions of men die as a consequence of fighting. Civilian casualties are really hard to measure because, in the Eastern Front, there's a lot more mobility in the conflict, and then with the fall of Russia and the subsequent Russian Civil War, in many ways, one could argue that the Russian Civil War is an extended conflict that is of World War I, which could have killed more people. If you were really talking about the Middle East, the war in the Middle East probably begins in 1908 and ends in 1923. So that's a way longer span of time. And in the Middle East, the entire country at some point is where fighting occurs. The entire region. Sorry, we're talking about the Ottoman Empire. In Europe specifically, on the Western Front, combat is so static that very few civilians are victimized by the violence relative to the other areas. So very few civilians die in the Western Front, but when we really look at the global nature of the war, we're talking about deaths in the millions of civilians in other parts of the war. So one specific event to talk about regarding World War I would be the Armenian Genocide, which is a genocide that has only actually, in probably the last 2 decades, become an event that is considered a genocide. It occurred before the UN established a legal definition of genocide, and also the government that came from the perpetrators of the genocide are still a government today. So the nation of Turkey still vehemently denies that what happened to Armenians during World War I was a genocide, despite the global consensus largely being that what happened to Armenians was a genocide. Okay, so the Young Turks, the Turkish nationalists who take control of the Ottoman Empire that lead up into World War I, become convinced that nationalist movements in the Ottoman Empire are the greatest threat to stability. As a consequence of that assessment, minorities begin to have their rights restricted and become targeted for violence from the state itself. One of the most sizable minorities within the Ottoman Empire were the population known as Armenians, which are a group of people that live, this is Anatolia, they live up here in northeastern Anatolia or the Caucasus Mountains. But as a consequence of their integration in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians lived across the Anatolian peninsula. I guess it counts as a peninsula, honestly, across Anatolia. As the war progresses, the Ottoman government began to more and more harshly and directly target Armenian populations. And what is so important about why we call the ethnic cleansing and violence that occurs in the 20th century genocide, where people have been killing other people because of their ethnicity for ever since the concept of ethnicity has existed, is that the 20th century and industrialization are fundamentally enable genocide. That the mass killing of people to the scale with which the Ottoman Empire and the Nazis do their killing is only possible through the concepts of modernity itself. So, for example, concepts like nationalism, concepts like industrialization and means like industrializations, all those enable states to exert influence on a population to compel them to become eradicators and then target populations to become eradicated. Okay, so like industrialization is what enables genocide. Okay, and so that's what, and so how the Ottomans did it, and where like they would like make all of the Armenians in a community like leave behind all their possessions, not tell them where they were going, and make them walk off into places in what is northern Syria today, into these deserts. And you were never given rest, you were given food, and if you fell, and you died. Most of the time, what happened would be the Ottomans would go into our Armenian community, kill all of the men, and then make women and children and older men walk until they died. And as many as 600,000 to 1.5 million people die as a consequence of the Armenian Genocide. And that kills a pretty sizable percentage of the Armenian population. That's the Ottoman Genocide. Okay, so the next thing to talk about would be pandemic diseases. Wouldn't you know that living in a dirty, wet trench for 4 years would make you susceptible to illnesses? And also people being forced to fight without sleep or get poor nutrients would also make you susceptible to illnesses. So the Spanish flu is a disease that becomes prevalent in the war fronts of World War I. The funny thing about the Spanish flu is why it's called the Spanish flu is because all the other countries, including America, were censoring the amount of soldiers who were getting the flu, but because Spain wasn't fighting in World War I, they were announcing that everyone was getting the flu, and so everyone's like, "Oh, the flu's coming from Spain." No, it was coming from the soldiers next to Spain who were spreading it into Spain. And then when soldiers returned, that led to the globalization of the disease. So it started as like a localized epidemic in the war front, specifically in Europe, and then became a pandemic which spread around the world, and as many as a third of the population of humanity got the flu in that period of time. But I think you guys probably feel a little bit more like, oh, we know what a pandemic is because we've lived through one. And I think that's a lot that I think that is to be said. So this should be making sense with you. What didn't happen is 100 million people dying. That did not happen with COVID. Millions died, right? But not tens of millions or over 100 million, right? So that's a pandemic, and that's another. I don't know why there's atrocity. That's mass death. Like it's a mass death thing, guys. I gotta be paused and write this gist. I cannot stand this subtopic, but give me a moment. Okay, so it's like these two things have nothing to do with each other, and they're in a subtopic. Like what? Why? Okay, so the first thing to talk about would be I've never heard it used in this way, but the lost generation is typically a term used to talk about a specific group of American writers who reflected upon what America was in the 20th century and became disillusioned with that idea. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, who wrote Old Men of the Sea, Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Those are examples of writers who are kind of like disillusioned with like what America was, but also I think a larger thing to discuss with the lost generation is the larger identity crisis that was caused among European populations as a consequence of World War I. Remember that I think we did a pretty good job in WAP about talking about how this ideology had become adopted among Europeans of their supremacy. Their supremacy in the world had become presumed. And World War I and its carnage and its death was a refutation of that European and white supremacy, which then led people to reflect and challenge the very foundation of that culture and society that dared to claim its own supremacy, right? That's what the lost generation is, okay? And then they were like, and a famine in Ukraine. So let's talk about the Holodomor for a second. So the Holodomor is the term used by Ukrainians to describe what is largely historically understood to be a artificially induced famine by the Soviets in the modern day region of Ukraine. Okay, so as a consequence of the reforms of collectivization by the Soviet Union, this required the abolition of land ownership and the collectivization of that land ownership to be worked by collectives to produce for the community of the whole Soviet Union and to feed them. In Ukraine itself, there was a sizable population of small landowners known as kulaks. These people owned the land, they produced profit off that land, but it was not like it was owned by very few people. When the Soviets chose to institute collectivization in Ukraine, many Ukrainians engaged in active and passive resistance of the collectivization process. So what I mean by active and passive resistance would be passively, they would be told to grow crops and they did not. Because they're like, if I grow crops, I'm not going to get these crops. They're going to go somewhere else. But actively, if then they were coerced to make those crops, like say, we will kill you or put you in jail if you don't make the crops, they would sometimes destroy those crops when they were being coerced. And what was the consequence of that was a famine in the Ukraine. However, a famine struck all of Russia during this period in the early 30s. And so Russia itself did not have the food to feed its population and did not apparently have the means to purchase food on the global market to give their population access to it, right? So at our most charitable, and I'm saying like the pro-Soviet perspective would be that everyone was having a famine, therefore they did not intentionally cause this. Then you have to think about there's some evidence that at the bare minimum the Soviets prioritized feeding other regions other than Ukraine, and also the rigor with which they introduced collectivization, there probably was a more protective means to do so that would lead to the mass famine, right? So because collectivization, Lenin even encouraged in the beginning early market systems, but that's not what Stalin decided. So that's the famine in Ukraine. That's also with the lost generation. Oh God. Okay, World War II. Lots of people died. Again, right? More people die in this one than they always said the sequel is bigger than the original, right? Half of the deaths of World War II are Soviet deaths. A huge percentage of the deaths are Soviet civilians, right? And that's something that's really important to note is that I think American culture often neglects the contribution and sacrifice that the Soviet Union put in during the war, just because of what happens after this war, and we fight the Cold War and things like that. So the Soviets pay the highest price in fighting this war. The U.S. loses. It's the second deadliest war in American history. The U.S. Civil War is the most deadly war, but it's kind of a cop out because we double count, right? But even if we did double count, the Union had higher casualties and deaths than we had in the war. But and then the civilian deaths are higher too, because the famines and problems we were talking about in World War I, it's even bigger in World War II. Now let's talk about the Nazis and their whole thing, right? We talked about Lebensraum in a previous video. So what's really important is that Nazism itself, German nationalism in and of itself, was a means that rationalized the eradication of populations and atrocities committed towards people, right? That's all in bold, and I can't stand that. Heinrich Himmler was a very influential member of the Nazi Party, specifically in their paramilitary wing known as the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which was like the group that had internalized the most, the Nazi ideology the deepest. Who they targeted Jews, they targeted Slavic people, they targeted the impaired, like the cognitively and physically impaired, LGBTQ people, right? But also keep in mind that what people considered LGBTQ in the 40s was not like what we would consider LGBTQ today, right? And then political dissidents, people who resisted them politically. An example of their policies would be the Nuremberg Laws, which codified anti-Semitism. It essentially de-citizenified. I'm just making up words right now. It made Jews not citizens of Germany anymore, even if they had been born in Germany, right? And they removed any legal protection and legal rights a Jewish person had within Germany, which then enabled atrocities to be committed against Jews because they were legally no longer people within Germany, right? And that is actually a very common practice in places the Nazis occupied during World War II. Places that kept Jewish people citizens actually saved their Jews, where states that were forced to like de-citizenize their Jewish people led to the highest deaths of Jews. Ghettos come back. You remember ghettos from Unit 1? I bet you do. And then the Nazis called the genocide of Jews the final solution. We refer to the genocide of Jews as the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a Greek term, actually, and it comes from like the ritual cleansing with fire. So that's like its genesis. And at the moment, I'm at a loss for why that's the term we use for it. It's always struck me as very powerful, though. In Japan, they're doing the similar things. Japanese nationalism puts Japanese interests over the interests of other groups, specifically other Asian populations. Despite the Pan-Asian image and appearance of Japanese efforts during World War II, oftentimes the most exploited people within occupied areas by Japan were other Asian people. It's like, for example, the Japanese occupied territory to cultivate food to feed the Japanese population at the expense of feeding the indigenous population that was cultivating the food. So you have mass famine in Korea, in China, and in Vietnam. Also, Asian people, Chinese people, Korean people were also, if they chose to do any kind of resistance, also experienced mass violence. One of the more traumatizing and kind of more standout atrocities Japanese commit during this period would be the use of comfort women, where indigenous women, be they Chinese, but most of them were Korean women, were abducted and then coerced into sex labor by the Japanese military. And Japan has never apologized for it, even to this day. It's a big thing. But it's not just the Axis that committed atrocities. The Americans and the British and the French committed atrocities too, and the Soviets too. We already talked about them. But for some reason, Amsco didn't talk about the Soviet atrocities. The Soviet atrocities were very bad as well, where like German civilians were like directly targeted and victimized by the violence as well, right? So the Allies, the topic that AMSCO focuses on is firebombing. So one of these theories that militaries had is that aerial bombardment would be like the most effective means of like using airplanes in the war, and they ultimately had a lot of benefits, but also think to the fact that any war that we talk about today, no one's mass bombing anymore. So that tells you something. But also we fight less wars too. So that tells you less than I implied, I guess. So they mainly used incendiary bombs, and these had the most maximal damage compared to just general explosive bombardment or using explosives to bombard cities. They would use incendiaries to create massive fires within cities. This would have a very destructive effect on cities. Oftentimes, what would happen in very, what do you call it? I wouldn't call them well planned, but in the most ideal manifestations of firebombing, a massive inferno known as a firestorm would develop in the center of a city or in areas of a city, which would create a suction or a vortex effect that would suck everything into the fire. Also would suck the air out of like bomb shelters, which would lead to people suffocating inside of these shelters that were supposed to keep them safe. So that's like really traumatizing, right? Hamburg and Dresden are the German cities that experienced the most significant fire bombings, and anywhere from like 10 to 30,000 people die in both of those fire bombings. Popular culture has taken hold of Dresden in a different way, mainly because of a book named Slaughterhouse-Five that you may read in one of your classes someday, where that book claims that 200,000 people died in Dresden. That is false. However, more than 200,000 people died in Tokyo because in Japan, all their buildings were wood, and so they burned down more, and that killed more people. Right? Actually, the firebombing of Tokyo killed more people than the atomic bombings did of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, depending on your estimates combined. And then we already talked about the bombing, so I'm not going to talk too much about those. Now we have some genocides. So we next have to talk about, first we're talking about Bosnia. So Bosnia, we talked a little bit about them with World War I. Bosnians are a Muslim Balkan minority. Serbs are a Orthodox Christian minority, and Croats are a Catholic minority. After World War I, they were integrated into a nation known as Yugoslavia, and that held together until the 1980s and 1990s. A communist leader known as Tito, he was in control of the Yugoslavia, and he was such a tyrant and effective at that job that he stopped all the different minorities from killing each other inside of Yugoslavia. However, when he dies, the Balkans really become the epitome of the term Balkanization, which is the disintegration of one state into a bunch of little states. What happens when Yugoslavia disintegrates? A man named Slobodan Milosevic, who was a Serb, an ethnic Serb, kind of seizes control of Serbia and compels the Serbs within Bosnia to commit acts of ethnic cleansing against the other minorities. But the largest group of minorities that are targeted through Milosevic's campaign of ethnic cleansing is our Bosnians. And he is eventually defeated by, they don't talk about this in AMSCO, but it's a theme they should talk about. NATO, which is an organization you'll learn about in a bit, it is the only time NATO, which is led by America, ever directly militarily intervenes in a conflict, where NATO intervenes directly in the Yugoslavian wars. They stop Serbia. They arrest Slobodan Milosevic. He is actually found guilty of crimes against humanity and actually sent to world prison, which is crazy. We'll talk about that a little bit with Darfur in a moment. With Rwanda, which is an African country, there were two there were two ethnic groups. You guys know Rwanda probably, but there were two large ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Hutus made up the numerical majority, but Tutsis had been the beneficiaries of privilege, so they had a political majority and influence as well. The Tutsis had been given historical preference by the Europeans that had colonized Rwanda, which were the Belgians. Throughout Rwanda's independence period, Hutus and Tutsis struggled to cooperate. Then the president of Rwanda, who was a Hutu, is killed in a plane crash allegedly caused by rebels who were of the Tutsi minority. This led to Hutus targeting Tutsis and killing 800,000 of them in 100 days. Which, if you extend out that rate to the length of the Holocaust, would be about the same number, I guess. So this was about as deadly, if not more deadly, than the Holocaust. You're just talking about what happened just to Jews, this, which is 6 million. But if we're talking about everyone in the Holocaust, it's probably more comparable. So what is really important about Rwanda is that it is a lesson in global cooperation and the limits of the global cooperation in the post-World War II and post-Cold War world. Everyone in the world literally knew this was happening. The UN had peacekeepers in Rwanda who witnessed Tutsis being murdered by Hutus. They saw it with their own eyes and did not directly intervene. And eventually, the rebels who were accused of killing the president of Rwanda actually invade Rwanda and overthrow this genocidal Hutu government. And it's not great still. It's still bumpy. So our final genocide we're going to talk about, what a rosy topic, is Sudan. So Sudan is a country that's was bisected, now is two countries, because now you have Sudan and South Sudan. But in the western region of Darfur, you had a and Arabs were like have been historically like the more prevalent ethnicity that's led Sudan. But in Darfur, you have African Muslims living there, and they were kind of challenging the government, specifically this Arab supremacist nature of the government. So they fight back. The Sudanese government then begins sponsoring Arab combatants to fight in Darfur against these African Muslims. The main group that fights against the Africans are known as the Janjaweed, which is like I don't think it's I don't think it's I think it's the indigenous language for like evil men on horseback. So very very straightforward. Now this time, somewhat the international response is more direct. In the 90s, actually around parallel to the time of Slobodan Milosevic's ethnic cleansing of the Balkans, the global community forms what's called the International Criminal Court, which has the responsibility of charging and investigating crimes against humanity. The idea of crime against humanity is a really fascinating thing that we can talk about for a long time. But the concept of a crime against humanity. Omar al-Bashir was the president of Sudan during this period. He was found guilty of a crime against humanity, but he has never been served time for his guilt. However, he was overthrown in a coup 4 years ago and hypothetically will be sent to serve his time for committing a crime against humanity. That remains to be seen. So those are our videos for the week. I will see you guys. You'll see me, and I'll see about a third of you after we get back. We are almost there, guys. We have one more unit after this one, where we're like doing quizzes and doing the whole rat race, and then things will be going in the review. So you guys are doing great. You guys have been getting better and better every single quiz and every single test. Mr. Jones, Mr. Rapport, and I are really proud of you. And so good work.